Okay, fasten your safety belts and away we go. And as you can hear, we're going to be talking about the fact that Donald Trump has now been indicted in New York, and we'll get into the details of what he's been indicted for as best we can. The indictment is still sealed, so we don't know the details, but we've got a pretty good sense, I think, of where this case is going and what it stems from. And so at the top of the board, I've got now presidential candidate Donald Trump, right? So that's his 2024 campaign that's now underway a couple years early. And of course, actually leaving the New York City court, Stormy Daniels, the woman who he allegedly gave $130,000 to, so as not to tell or sell her story. When I say he gave it, actually he had Michael Cohen give it to Stormy Daniels and then reimbursed Michael Cohen, $130,000 plus fees. And then we have Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in New York City, who brought the charges. And so we're going to get into this tawdry affair in just a moment. But the bigger question I want to discuss with you today is not per se the details of this case or even the other looming legal troubles for the president, and the circle of daunting legal trouble seems to be closing in on him. And as you can see in the bottom of the screen, I've got images from what I consider to be the more serious potential legal liabilities, particularly centered around the January 6th insurrection on Congress, and more generally on efforts to overturn the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. But please note, that these issues have to do with our so-called political branches of government, and we're now going to ask our judicial, our non-political branch of government, to handle the disputes that come out of it. And the question is, can they handle it? Can they handle it not just in the sense of generating legal outcomes and resisting violence of the mob kind that we saw on January 6th, but more, I think, deeply, can they produce some sort of consensus in our society that justice is being done, that the rule of law is being forced? And I don't think that that's an expectation we should have too much faith in. And then the deeper question still, could we end up with Donald Trump in jail, and in so doing excise, like cancer, the plague that is troubling our democracy right now? And again, I think my short answer is no, and that Trump is symptomatic, but not the primary cause. He's also accelerating and amplifying the trouble in our constitutional democracy, but it cannot be reduced to him, and therefore putting him in jail is unlikely to address the underlying rot. By the way, we were talking before we started about why New York first, and I'll just say this very quickly. I have no idea why I completely agree. The weakest case is the first case that's being brought, but I do think one upshot of this is, to the extent that Fani Willis or the Department of Justice were perhaps weighing whether or not they should indict, not just based on the evidence available to them, the likelihood of success, but also on the deeper political question of whether or not it is in the interest, good for the health of our constitutional democracy, to indict a former president who is also a current candidate for the presidency and leading his party in the polls and in terms of the direction of the politics of the party. Now that New York has indicted, in a sense, they don't have to weigh that issue anymore. It's not a question of whether to indict, it's a question of whether to add an additional indictment to Donald Trump. And I think that makes it much more likely that Trump will also be indicted in Georgia and indicted by the Department of Justice. So let's get a little bit of information, a little bit of details. I don't want to focus here, in part because I think this is pretty straightforward, in part also because we don't actually have all the information yet. The indictment is still sealed and won't be unsealed until Trump is arraigned on Tuesday. But we do have a sense of the underlying fact scenario here, which is that right in October of 2016, when Donald Trump was still a candidate for the presidency, he directed his fixer, Michael D. Cohen, to pay the former porn star with whom he'd had an affair starting in Lake Tahoe, I believe in 2011, $130,000 in exchange for her not going public about their affair. And Trump then reimbursed $130,000 plus fees to Cohen and wrote it off as a business expense, arguably in part pursuant to the cover-up, arguably also because Trump cannot resist anything that allows him to minimize his tax burden. So the question is, if that's an accurate overview of the fact scenario, do those facts actually amount to a clear-cut crime given the law in the state of New York? And there is one clear-cut crime here, and that's the misdemeanor offense of falsifying business records, right? Not writing in your ledger that this was a payoff to keep somebody silent or just eating the expense, but instead trying to write it off as a legal expense. Having said that, the statute of limitation has already passed on that misdemeanor offense. So it's only possible to charge somebody for that for 2 years. And by the way, that's almost never charged in New York, especially for something as minor as this relative to the scale or the size of the Trump business. So on the other hand, if the falsifying of business records is pursuant to another crime, and if that crime is a felony, then the falsifying of business records can be charged as a felony, and then the statute of limitations hasn't expired, and then the legal consequence for Trump is much higher, right? It's not just a fine, it's potential jail time. And it does appear, we don't know, but based on what's leaking out and what seems to be, in terms of the people who were brought in to testify to the grand jury, the likely scenario here is that they do want to charge this as a felony. And then the felony violation would be violation of federal campaign finance law. Essentially, the reason that Daniels was paid off was to keep her quiet in October of 2016, i.e. to prevent an October surprise that might have derailed the campaign of Donald Trump. And to be very clear, Trump actually could pay Stormy Daniels $130,000 to be quiet, right? That's his right to do if, for instance, he's trying to just burnish his reputation as a businessman or doesn't want his current wife and children to find out about it, right? That would not be a crime. It's only in the first instance because he claimed it as a business expense, and in the second interest, if the reason he did it in October of 2016 is not to protect his reputation for business or family purposes, but as part of his presidential campaign. And here I want to say, as a matter of interpretation, it seems pretty clear that that's what happened, right? That is to say, he didn't pay her off in 2013 or 2014 or 2015, but only when he was very close to the finish line of a presidential campaign. But having said that, this will be part of the burden for the prosecution to prove. And I think you're right. What's clear to you and me as a matter of interpretation may not rise to the standard of right beyond a reasonable doubt, which is necessary for a criminal conviction. You add to that Trump was never charged with the critical federal election law crime that elevates the otherwise misdemeanor to a felony. And you've got a very complicated legal theory that seems to be at work here. And this is why I think many people looking at this think this is probably the weakest, the least dangerous of Trump's potential criminal liabilities that are being investigated right now. And I just want to add very quickly, apparently, again, this is being leaked, this is a 30 count indictment. And I don't know. I mean, indictments often have complicated technical aspects to them, whether what I've just described to you gets us to a 30 count indictment or not, or maybe there are aspects to this we're not seeing that perhaps will make Alvin Bragg's case stronger than it appears today. We'll know more on Tuesday. So pivoting now from that to the fact that because this is has occurred, Trump is much more likely to face additional indictment. And I want to be as clear as possible. I don't think Bragg had to indict for Jack Smith to indict or for Fani Willis to indict, right? Jack Smith is the special counsel with the Department of Justice. Fani Willis is the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia. Those are the two other places that Trump seems most likely to face criminal prosecution in the near future. But having said that, the fact that he has actually been indicted now removes, I think, a major consideration from the deliberations going on, no doubt, in Smith and Willis's offices about whether or not it's appropriate to, whether it's good to, whether it's healthy to indict a former president, a current presidential candidate, or whether instead they should exercise prosecutorial discretion and not indict. So what are these other legal jeopardies that Trump faces? Let's start for a moment with the January 6th Special Congressional Investigative Committee. And just to note that they recommended prosecution to the Department of Justice on several counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, and that is to overturn the outcome of the election, including putting false slates of electors into the Electoral College, trying to get them certified; obstruction of an official proceeding of Congress, right? That's the meeting of the Electoral College; conspiracy to make a false statement. That's the considerable evidence that was presented by the committee that Trump had been told repeatedly by his own attorney general, by other lawyers in his orbit, by his campaign manager, that he had lost the election. And so he was knowingly spreading disinformation about the election when he maintained that it was only because of election machine fraud, or because dead people had voted, or because immigrants had voted illegally, or because people had voted in more than one jurisdiction simultaneously. All of that stuff was false. And in the context in which a president is trying to challenge the outcome of an election, that's a part of a conspiracy. And then finally, inciting and aiding an insurrection. And I note all of this not because the January 6th committee has the authority, has the jurisdiction to bring charges against the president. It does not. It is the legislative and not the judicial branch. But the fact that it unanimously recommended, the fact that it was constituted as a bipartisan committee, the fact that the legislative branch is asking the executive branch to bring criminal charges, I think does have some weight in Jack Smith's deliberations. He is, as far as we can tell, doing a speedy but deliberative and thorough investigation into the January 6th invasion of the Congress and whether or not the president incited and aided that insurrection. And citing is hard to prove, right? It's not enough to say something. You have to have an imminent threat of violence that your speech, which would otherwise be protected by the First Amendment, directly contributes to. Aiding the insurrection, I believe, has to do with not directing, right, the National Guard or other forces to intervene in order to protect Congress for several hours. The efforts to overturn the election results, including false elector slates, pressure on Vice President Pence disseminating false information about the election, all of this presents considerable legal jeopardy. Then there is the additional unrelated, but nevertheless now part of Jack Smith's portfolio, investigation into the retention of highly classified information after Donald Trump left office in Mar-a-Lago, and the fact that not only is this an apparent violation of the Espionage Act, that by itself might not be enough, right? Given that both Joe Biden and Mike Pence also retained classified information after they left office and kept it in their private residences or offices. But the fact that both Pence and Biden cooperated and immediately returned those documents as soon as they were found, whereas there seems to be some evidence that Donald Trump actually obstructed the investigation, that seems to me to put Trump in further legal jeopardy with this regard. If you're following these investigations, you know that it is the case that whether it's trying to keep Trump's lawyers from having to testify or turn over documents because what they have is protected by attorney-client privilege, but there's something called the fraud crime exception, that Trump has lost those motions trying to keep Pence from having to testify. Again, Pence has partially prevailed on one of his challenges to that, but Donald Trump has lost. And it does raise the question, given all this legal jeopardy, whether or not Donald Trump has adequate legal counsel. And when I say adequate, clearly he has a bunch of high-paid lawyers. But it is also the case that I think many of the best criminal defense lawyers in the United States will not represent Donald Trump because he is such a hard client to represent. He does not follow instructions. He treats criminal prosecution as an opportunity for political self-promotion much more than he does take seriously the integrity of the legal process. And so lots of examples of that coming out of the two failed impeachment hearings. And you might say, in light of the failure of those impeachments, that he did actually perhaps play things correctly, but this is not a political procedure. This is a legal procedure. And I do think there's signs that Trump may not have the legal team in place that would best allow him to fend off, to defend himself, to ultimately defeat these prosecutions, given the complexity and the fact that it seems likely that they're going to be simultaneous prosecutions by several different prosecutors. The third and final major threat to Trump comes from Fani Willis, the Fulton County, Georgia prosecutor or district attorney. And this centers on Trump's effort to persuade or induce the Secretary of State, Raffensperger, to find nearly 12,000 votes in order to change the results of the Georgia election. The effort to get false testimony in front of Georgia state legislatures, the effort to create and certify false electors, right? And what's interesting here is that the grand jury has concluded, apparently, we can tell they've recommended indicting, and the district attorney has yet to indict. But the other thing that seems clear, particularly given the transcript of the conversation between Trump and Raffensperger, that this really does very well fit the facts of the case and the law of Georgia, that Trump did try to induce a state official to alter the outcomes of an election, that he threatened the official with potential legal consequences if he didn't. And so I think one of the questions that we may have to wait a while on is whether New York will be the only jurisdiction prosecuting Trump, or whether ultimately both the federal government and a district attorney in Georgia will also be prosecuting Trump. Finally, I just looked this up. There's a organization called Just Security that tracks all of the pending legal cases against Trump. 23 of them right now, many of them civil, several of them settled or dismissed, but most of them still pending. And so Trump's legal troubles continue to mount. And I just want to pause for a moment here, right? The president of the United States is the chief law enforcement agent of the United States. He heads the executive branch, whose job it is, whose institutional role is to enforce and execute the laws of the United States. And the idea that the former president of the United States is facing all of this legal jeopardy, I think does speak to the low point we are at as a constitutional democracy, that Donald Trump is a pathological norm and law breaker, and that we nevertheless elected him president, does speak to, I think, deeper issues troubling our country. And so that allows me to transition into the question, if our democracy is in crisis, if one of the signs that it is in crisis is that Donald Trump was president, and that we are now having to deal with the fact that his law breaking before and during and after being president are creating political crises for us, could the prosecution of Trump help us to resolve these crises? And I think that then leads us to the question, what do we hope to accomplish? What might be our hopes for the prosecution and perhaps conviction of Donald Trump? One thing to hope for would be to exonerate, defend, maintain the principle of equality under the law. No matter who you are, no matter how powerful or rich you are, you have to obey the law like everybody else, right? So the former president does not get a pass if there is clear evidence of criminal wrongdoing. The second, I think, principle is of accountability for the president and others entrusted with concentrated state power, right? And so this is an idea not only that we have to uphold the rule of law and equality under the law, but in particular use the rule of law to prevent the abuse of power, right? Power is vested in certain offices for certain purposes. If it is misused or abused, then trust has been violated and it needs to be restored to deter future abuse of power. And I do think that both of those goals can, in fact, be well served by prosecuting the former president. But the third goal, and this is the one I think that so many people hang hopes on, is not just the narrow legal goal of showing that even the president or former president is accountable under the law, but also that somehow we will put American politics on more secure foundations, that Donald Trump is a peculiar and particular threat to our democracy, and that successfully prosecuting him could remove that threat. I think is a very difficult proposition to assess and evaluate. And so to characterize the kind of threat, it's not just that he's a liar and a norm and law breaker, it's also that he has encouraged a certain kind of cruelty in American politics, which is increasingly taking hold in the Republican Party. The most recent examples would be not only the anti-immigrant politics, but also the anti-transsexual politics, and also the ethno-racial authoritarian populism of Donald Trump, which I'll say more about in just a moment. So would prosecuting and convicting Trump ultimately discredit the Trump or Make America Great Again, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, so that the Republican Party could go back to being a normal, norm enforcing party, a party that shows fidelity to the core norms of constitutional democracy, including, right, only nominating candidates who seem clearly to respect the law. And I just worry deeply that we can't solve our problems, our political problems, our social problems through legal mechanisms. So let me say a little bit why. Mm, Then I'll get into some details. So the first question here is whether the legal and judicial systems are legitimate and trusted enough to actually convince those who currently support Trump that Trump is in fact guilty as charged, if evidence is adduced to demonstrate that. And I just don't think that's true. I'm about to present a bunch of evidence, but please note that the very reason that we have Donald Trump is because there is a widespread perception that our legal system is rigged, that it serves only the powerful, that Donald Trump was the first political entrepreneur to really give clear and effective voice to that suspicion, that mistrust, that alienation, and is very effective at playing the card that says the reason I'm being prosecuted or persecuted, if you prefer, is because I've stood up and told this truth, and the entire elite class, Republican and Democrat, nonpartisan judicial media elite, are trying to prevent me from holding to them to account for what they've done to you. And so there's a sense in which, as opposed to being salutary, the prosecution of Trump may actually further inflame the grievance, the alienation, the anger of those who support him. And so this then gets to the second level. Would convicting Trump excise the cancer-eating American democracy, right? If that is the right-wing ethno-racial authoritarian populist politics, and my clear answer to that is by itself, no. We've got to get to the roots of the problem. Trump is not the root. He is accelerating, amplifying. He is uniquely charismatic I think those of us who don't like him sometimes have a hard time seeing that he is charming and funny and a very good storyteller and has really figured out how to tap into this deep vein of resentment, which is a justified vein of resentment, even if the way in which it's being channeled is gross and awful, and that no other party or politician has succeeded in articulating the anger about the direction that the United States is taking in the way that Trump has. And so, right, we have to be careful in not confusing the symptom for the root of the problem. Yes, we need to punish the president for violating his most basic duties, like handing over power after he lost an election, or not misusing the office of the presidency to try to subvert democracy. But we also have countervailing constitutional duties. And here that includes the need to repair democracy and restore faith in central institutions. And I'll be as clear as possible. I'm not sure you can do both at once, but it does seem to me, if you only do the first, if you only punish the former president without doing anything to try to restore faith in the impartiality, the fairness, the equality of the overall legal system, then you really run the risk of exacerbating the problem, increasing the polarization and conflict in our society. And so to do this, we need to be able to not just prosecute Trump, which I'll call retrospective justice, but also pursue a policy agenda that makes Trump's politics less attractive in the United States in the coming decades. So that's the stress test, and right, this is the trial of a former president and a leading presidential candidate. And it occurs at a moment of multiple intersecting crises. We have COVID still looming large in our society. We have inflation and the Federal Reserve and stress on the banking system. And we have the highest level of inequality perhaps ever recorded in our society. This would be a political trial, right? I don't think there's any way you can have the trial of a former president and it not be a political trial in an era of hyperpartisanship, right? In which the Republican Party really appears incapable of fidelity to democratic norms. And when I say the party is incapable, I don't mean that its current leaders, I don't mean that the elites in the party are making bad decisions, right? Mitt Romney, John McCain, Mitch McConnell, even Lindsey Graham, right, originally criticized Donald Trump, and those who survive have mainly needed to fall back in line in supporting him, right? And so will the Republican Party support the rule of law and equality before the law? I think the evidence is pretty clear that before the indictment has been unsealed, we're getting widespread condemnation. This is a trial also at a moment of epistemic anarchy, right? It's a moment in which the media, the public, and Trump are all reinforcing, right, the idea that they have a truth that cannot be refuted with evidence, right? So what's the right way in which trials proceed? Primarily via fact finding, right? And in a world in which the idea of facts itself is increasingly contested and suspect, it's just unclear that a court of law has the epistemic authority required to do the work that we ask it to do. This is also a moment of what I've been referring to as algorithmically amplified affect. People are angry and resentful, right? I mean, what we learned with the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News. Dominion is the electronic ballot machine manufacturer that is suing Fox News for defamation and liability from the damage to its reputation that's been done because the Fox News hosts and opinion people said again and again and again that their machines had been hacked and that otherwise Donald Trump would have won the election. And then there was a discovery procedure, and as a result, Dominion got access to the texts that Fox News and opinion figures were sending to each other. And what we learned is basically that the Fox people didn't believe what they were saying on the air. Right. So privately, they were disgusted with Trump. They thought he was lying. But they also recognized that if they did not repeat what Trump was saying, their audience share, their ratings would plummet and go elsewhere. And so the idea that their business model is catering to an audience that feels disrespected by mainstream media and therefore has to be respected by the Fox News hosts. And that means telling them what they believe, even when what they believe is demonstrably false, right? That speaks, it seems to me, to a different kind of emotional environment in our country at the moment, an environment in which you cannot try to persuade people of the truth, or if you do, you risk your entire, and here we could talk about the Republican Party risking its electoral viability. We could talk about Fox News risking its audience share. We could talk about the evangelical movement, right, which has in the past strongly condemned immorality and infidelity in political candidates, all of a sudden falling in behind Trump, despite the fact that, right, he's a serial cheater on his wives, that he cheats in his business empire. He's declared bankruptcy multiple times. He's bragged about sexual predation, right? It seems to me all of these organizations are increasingly beholden to a very angry, very resentful group of persons who are no longer capable of being steered or corrected or met halfway by elite institutions. And so this then gets us to the point where there's just deep mistrust of our own systems of government. Let me provide a little bit of evidence to this effect, right? So, right, the federal government, the trust level is 24% right now, not an all-time low, but pretty close, and obviously an abysmal level. The trust in major American institutions, that includes the courts and media, as well as firms and the economy, right? The lowest level ever recorded by Gallup, who's been conducting polls on this for almost 50 years. Turning now to the judiciary in particular, right? Only 1 in 3 Americans have confidence in the courts and the judiciary. 70% in this Gallup survey say the courts favor the wealthy. 66% say they become too political. And if you look here, right, at the level of trust in the Supreme Court, the jury system, the judiciary and judges, state and local courts, federal and courts other than the Supreme Court, it's all less than 50%. And I think that the deep underlying problem here, right? 70% say the courts favor the wealthy. Nearly 80% say that there are 2 tiers of justice, one for politicians and insiders, elites and the wealthy, and then another for the rest of us. And this reflects then a deeper problem in American democracy. 2/3 of the American people believe there is too much inequality and that the federal government is responsible for it. And they are right in both respects. On the one hand, right, when we look at what's happened with the tax code, right, you can see, right, that when you compare 2018 with 1978 and 1950, the richest people are now paying much less of a share of the tax burden than everyone else. Whereas, right, everybody else's tax burden has gone up and gone up dramatically as a result of tax revisions. And this is just I have to be careful. I think I misstated it. Not gone up dramatically. Everybody else's tax burden has gone up, not gone up dramatically. And the result. This is, let me just be as clear as possible, the tip of the iceberg. And today is not the day, but one of the things I'll be talking with you about later this month is the idea that through a whole series of legal changes that has occurred from the 1970s to the present, the playing field in our economy and society has been tilted in favor of the hyper wealthy, the most powerful, the firms, and away from ordinary people. And another way to look at what's giving rise to the sense that we live in a deeply unfair society and that government is complicit in benefiting the powerful and screwing the little people is the level of debt, right? From the 1960s through the 1990s, Americans on average were saving money. They had some disposable income in excess of their structural expenses. From 1994 to the present, Americans have been spending more than they make. Their salary, their wages have not kept pace with their cost of living. This is reflected in the profound inequality in our society, right? The level of inequality in the 1980s compared with the level of inequality at present, it's just a totally different world that we're living in. So much of the income has gone to the top 0.01%, the top 1%, the top 10%. The middle and the bottom of the income distribution have been left out. Wages have stagnated despite the fact that the economy is growing. Fully a third of the population, actually close to 50% of the population, is living on $30,000 a year or less. 40% of the population has less than $400 in savings, right? This is the stunning unfairness of our economy and our society. And simultaneously, right, growth has declined. The share of income generated in our society that's paid out as wages has declined. The amount of taxes that government is able to levy has declined. And so the level of both government and individual debt has skyrocketed. And the sense that government is simply no longer able to level the playing field or to protect the vulnerable and the suffering is widespread and part of the deeper context here. This is playing out then in terms of right, the wages going down, government doing less, in terms of what are called deaths of despair, right? And in particular, white Americans, white working class Americans are dying from suicide, from opioid overdose, from the diseases of stress and alcoholism that stress tends to produce. And to be as clear as possible, the life expectancy in the United States overall is coming down, and it's coming down because white Americans, white working class Americans are dying deaths of despair. And so when we ask, where the anger and the mistrust in our institutions come from, I think we have a pretty good answer. I would point out to you then that the other thing that has happened over really the last decade, and here I pointed you before to Matthew Continenti's long history of the Republican Party, goes back really over 100 years, or Nicole Hemmer's shorter history, which goes back just to the 1990s and up to the present, is to suggest that the Republican Party has become the party of grievance, the party that really is successful at channeling the anger, alienation, resentment at the unfairness in our politics. And it has channeled it in a particular and destructive direction, right? The idea that the election was stolen has become de rigueur. It's required almost in the Republican Party. And this reflects an underlying view, and I know I'm going fast and covering a lot of territory, but I want to try to synthesize a number of ideas here. So I'm pointing now to Arlie Hochschild, professor emeritus of sociology at UC Berkeley, and her book Strangers in Their Own Land, and this idea, having spent years in southern Louisiana, meeting people, talking with people, going to their churches and picnics and bowling leagues, that she eventually got what she considered to be their deep story, and she basically became convinced that the white Southerners who she was spending all this time with believed that the idea of opportunity in the United States, the idea that if you worked hard, did your duty, you would eventually obtain economic security, and life would be better for you and especially better for your children, had fundamentally come apart, had fallen out of reality in the period from the 1980s to the present, in which the government passed all of these laws and regulations that undid unions, that skewed the distribution of both income and wealth as well as power in favor of the rich, that no longer was it the case that hard work in the United States at a job could get you economic security, and that this view that she articulated as a deep story of people waiting in line to gain access to a shining city on another side of a hill, that line had completely stalled and was now moving backwards, right? And that the reason it was moving backwards was because the government was assisting other people in getting in line ahead of the white working class people who had benefited from hard work and participation in the American economy up until this point. That the people who were being pushed in line ahead of them were African Americans, other racial minorities, and recent immigrants. And the sense that, on the one hand, mainstream politics had been captured, taken over by people who only favored elites. And on the other hand, if there was an injustice that elite political actors, particularly Democrats, were going to pay attention to, it wasn't the injustice of the stalling of opportunity, the rendering precarious, the shattering of expectations of the white working class. It was the grievances of racial minorities, right? And so this sense that there was a deep well of alienation, mistrust, anxiety in American politics that nobody was effectively speaking to until the Tea Party, until Donald Trump came along, and that Donald Trump in particular is still the only prophet of this group of Americans I think has to be taken into account when we ask, will his conviction address the underlying problems that have made Donald Trump such a force in our politics? And I think it's quite clear that he won't. I'm going to point you to that the conviction of him, even if it is successful, even if it's an exemplary trial, even if he's convicted in multiple venues on multiple counts, I think it's entirely possible that he will no longer be a viable candidate for the president if he's convicted. I don't think that's guaranteed. I don't think that's a slam dunk, but I think it's entirely possible. But I think it's also entirely possible that that just further exacerbates the polarization, the anger, the resentment that is so destructive in our politics. And so let me just point out, right, in a book I've spoken with you about before, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat's How Democracies Die, they point to political parties as being extremely important for enforcing democratic norms on candidates to occupy political leadership positions, right? So this is a view that says institutions matter, and that the Constitution in our democracy cannot maintain themselves unless they're met halfway by. And then I think we could say political parties, media institutions, churches, and other civil society organizations. And in light of what has happened in the United States over the last 40 to 50 years, those institutions are no longer able to play the role of inculcating respect for core democratic norms. They're no longer able to maintain the political culture for the subset of the American population that feels left out, unfairly treated, bypassed, unrepresented, aggrieved. And so I think in those circumstances, you can't then ask the judiciary, right? The least dangerous branch, the branch without the power of the purse or the sword to fix the underlying problem. Let me conclude briefly, and this is actually, in a sense, where John started us out, with one idea, which is that I think it's entirely possible that the prosecution of Trump, whether successful or not, might continue to erode Trump's support, obviously not with his loyal followers, but with voters who form an essential part of the Republican coalition, right? Suburban and ex-urban, upper middle class, especially women, people who've been being peeled off slowly. 2016, they kind of held their noses and voted for Trump. 2020, less so. 2022, less so. But could we get to the point where perhaps the Republican Party is no longer electorally viable? The idea that you need the Trump base, that you can't win elections without those people being highly mobilized, but they repel others. And if they repel enough others, then ultimately this coalition doesn't hold together. And the Republican Party has to have a crisis of identity. I think that's the only potential good upshot of this pending trial. But I do have to say, I think we have to be very careful about hoping for that. That's a pretty long shot scenario. Why don't we go ahead and open it up for discussion? Who wants to start us out? Go ahead, woman.
The irony, the supreme irony, is that all of these people, the disaffected, are turning to the Republican Party to be their saviors, and that is the party that has traditionally exacerbated their position, does not represent what would help them. And is that the failure of the Democratic Party to stand up for proper values? I mean, this is so outrageous. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely right, Wilma. And please note, right, that Donald Trump, the prophet of the aggrieved, his only major legislative accomplishment was a tax cut that further benefits the wealthy, right? And at that level, I think we have to say two things. The first is that symbolism and affect matter more than policy for the people in question, right? Donald Trump is angry like they are, and he's angry in the right way at the right people. He gives vent to their grievance. The sense that something is deeply wrong was not being effectively channeled by either the Democratic or the Republican Party. The Democrats might have been trying, right? Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, but ultimately they were too weak-willed, lackluster, or hampered by all the bottlenecks in the American legislative system to really do much about it, right? And so there are problems that are structural problems as well. But yes, I do think, of course, there's a deep-seated irony here that the party that is now led by the person who gives vent to the grievance is also the party that is primarily responsible for the policies that generate the grievance in the first place. You put your finger on it, Wilma. Thank you. Bob, I think I saw your hand next.
Yeah, somewhat as a follow-up to what Wilma is saying, because I absolutely think that's true. But if Trump is or the Republicans are the leader of the grievance party, then all the Black people should be voting for him. They are the people who've got the biggest grievances in this country. And so that's sort of a point. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I just was reading an article or a column by David Brooks, where he was looking at a survey that said how patriotic people were 5 years ago and how patriotic they are now. Great drops in that, in religion and community and all sorts of things that people are. I don't think he put a word on where they were going. He's just saying that they used to be here and they are now way far away from that, or way far away from quote unquote traditional values.
Yeah, I haven't read the Brooks column, so I'm not going to comment on that other than to say that there's a fair bit of survey research showing that people are disaffected, showing that they are alienated, and it doesn't surprise me at all to find them withdrawing support for traditional institutions, whether that be patriotism for government or faith with religion. But having said that, I want to return to your first comment about, well, why aren't Blacks supporting the politics of Trump? And I want to be as clear as possible, right? The way in which the grievance of, and then we've got to fill in whose grievance it is, working class white people, right, who've had their expectations shattered. And here, I think it's really important to note that sociology again and again shows that what matters is not absolute outcomes, but relative outcomes, right? And relative to who you compare yourself with, but also relative to what you expected them to be. And frankly, African Americans, given the long history of and then we could start with enslavement and expropriation, but going forward to discrimination, just never had those expectations. But please also then note that what Trump is doing is scapegoating, right? So he's blaming immigrants and Blacks and elites in the federal government and the media for preferring the interests of people of color and immigrants over the interests of the traditional working class whites. That Black people understand that perfectly well. So yes, they have grievances too, but their grievances are not well articulated by Trump, to say the least. Iris, go ahead.
Yes, I think I would like to give some focus to cults. The last cult I remember blew himself up by poisoning his entire group. And the disaffected, first of all, are being fed the big lie, not so much to love the Republican Party, but to love their cult leader, Trump. If he switched parties to the upfront party or any party, they'd follow him. The Republican Party is paying tribute to this cult leadership because they're benefiting from it through their social media income. And
Is it on my end? Iris, you froze on me. But I think I'm going to go ahead and respond, and hopefully we'll get you. Okay, you're back now. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm asking you if we can find out enough about how cults die to figure out how to move people off of their pedestals of cult worship.
Yeah, so I'm not going to agree with you completely that Donald Trump's following constitutes a cult, right? And I don't want to get into technical definitions of cults, etc. But just to point out that there is always a strong admixture of charismatic leadership and following of a charismatic leader in democratic politics. I shouldn't say always. Obviously, we've had our Gerald Fords and George H.W. Bushes for president, right? But it's very often the case. And again, those of us who dislike Trump, I think sometimes fail to credit the degree to which he has charisma, charm, humor, a larger than life personality, a capacity to entertain his crowds, and it may be peculiar, but it works, right? And so I will completely agree with you that I'm not sure I've got the vocabulary for it, but I almost view Trump in the way that, say, I view Mick Jagger, right? That we project our ideas, our fantasies about, with Mick Jagger being a purely libidinal self onto this other character who struts around stage, right? And then we project onto Donald Trump the capacity to finally stick it to the elite and to basically be the bull in the china shop when he occupies the White House, that there's a sense of identification that is much more than loyalty to a party. And in fact, Donald Trump has succeeded in, I think, completing the realignment in American politics, in which all of the people who are angry and resentful and channel that anger and resentment into racist anti-establishment politics are now with the Republicans because they're with Trump. That, I think, is a major structural liability ultimately for the Republican Party if Trump loses his viability as a mainstream political candidate. But as we started out talking about, as John called our attention to, the idea that he might still have a very strong influence on his core constituents. And if he tells them to stay home, or if he tells them to vote for a third party, or if he continues to ridicule whoever is the leading candidate for the Republican Party just because he can't help himself, right? Because he wants to stay the center of attention, that may very well, at least in 2024, undo the coalition. The question is, does it ultimately fracture the coalition in a deeper way that leads the Republican Party to finally begin to reconstitute its coalition in a way that relies less on voter suppression and the very peculiar over-representation of less populous areas in the Constitution, to rely less on gerrymandering, and to really seek to reconstitute itself so it can compete for a 21st century majority electoral coalition, which means becoming more diverse, more urban. And that would be very healthy for our democracy. But I don't think we can expect that to happen just because Trump is tried or convicted. We really need to figure out how we can restore some confidence in the idea that our mainstream parties and institutions serve the interests of the majority of Americans. David, go ahead. You've had your hand up for a long time.
Well, I just wanted to say, and it sort of builds on the points that have been made by Wilma, Bob, and Iris, and that is, and I read this in I can't remember which pundit a couple of days ago, who was saying that Trump really has two constituencies. One are people who are mainstream Republicans who are ironically coming to his rescue with this first lawsuit because it's easy for them to support Trump with this lawsuit. Had they taken one of the others, like the Georgia case, it wouldn't have been so easy for mainstream Republicans to come to his support. So that's a kind of an irony that we have to live with in the sequence of these lawsuits. But the two constituencies are mainstream Republicans who hold their nose and support him, and the other are the true devotees, the people who will follow him anywhere. And of course, the devotees, as people have said, would follow him to any party, would follow him into an insurrection, would happily follow him into an insurrection. They would think that it was the American thing to do. But what I really want to go back to is thinking about poor Blacks, poor immigrants, poor whites, even middle class in all those categories. And we've let the debate play out on ideological, political, and even ethnic and racial terms in terms of providing scapegoats for the disenfranchised, when the real issue is an economic one. And I'm reminded of James Carville, and I can't remember whether it was 94 or 96, who kept saying, "It's the economy, stupid." And why can't we, those who oppose Trump and the ideological fellows who go along with him, make an argument that the real enemy of both of all people who aren't getting their fair share of wealth or opportunity are really the as you call them, the hyper or ultra rich, and make the argument on those grounds. And it just seems to me that, as you pointed out, Sanders and Warren were trying to go there, but they didn't do it effectively. And I'm wondering if that might be a different ploy that points to a different sort of source of the problem that would be an effective counter to Trump. That's all.
Yeah. So you made 2 points, right? And one of them concerned differentiating the devotees from the ordinary Republicans, and to suggest that the ordinary Republicans may get some cover in opposing the prosecution from the fact that the sequence here is New York first. I just want to point out to you, right, I showed a diagram, I didn't really dwell on it, that showed the vast majority of ordinary Republican candidates, and I believe you're talking now about elected officials, right? Mainstream Republican elected officials denied that the election of 2020 was correctly decided, right? They repeated the big lie, or at least echoed it in weakened versions, right? And so I think we have to be careful to not exaggerate the capacity of the mainstream of the Republican Party to resist Trump's influence over their base, their core voters, right? People without whom they can win, they won't win elections, right? So that's a minor point, but I don't know that I agree that the rank and file, I'm not rank and file, but that mainstream Republicans, I'm not sure how many of them are left, to be honest, but that if it had been Georgia first, wouldn't have immediately rallied to Trump's support. On your second claim, and Carver's 1992, by the way, right, Bill Clinton's first campaign. Let's focus for a second on Bill Clinton. What does Bill Clinton do? Right, he signs NAFTA. He repeals welfare, ending welfare as we know it. He, and we could keep going, but he is the first of the new Democrats, right? The globalizers. And I think this is part of the problem, right? Which is even the candidate whose manager says it's the economy, stupid, doesn't actually govern in a way that assists ordinary working people in improving their economic standing, their security, and we could keep going, right? I put the deaths of despair graph on the board, right? A lot of that has to do not just with how much you're paid, but how much recognition or respect you think you're afforded within the economy, how much dignity there is associated with your work, which has something to do with how good your job is, right? And if you're driving an Uber or working in an Amazon fulfillment station, you feel both invisible and disrespected, right? And so I think at this point we have to really recognize that, yes, there's a potential coalition out there of a whole bunch of people who feel left out of this economy, and they don't just feel it, they are, right, unfairly treated. But having said that, that involves passing policy, and that's really hard to do. And not only the Republicans, but the Democrats have failed to do this for a long time. And you can't point your finger exclusively at one party and say the only reason the Democrats haven't passed better legislation is because of Republican obstructionism. Frankly, the Democrats have been a conduit for policy that has been bad for the majority of Americans and good only for them. Call them the hyper wealthy, call them elite, call them what you will. Flossie, I'm going to let you have the last comment for today. You do have to unmute yourself, remember. Thank you, David, by the way. Good comments. Appreciate it. So you got to hold your space bar down or push that little icon with the, you got it. There you go.
I worry about what is happening to children, teenagers, and kids in school who are being shot down. The teenagers are killing themselves on drugs, or they're killing each other. And well, why are they killing themselves? They don't know, they don't understand, they're sick. And the babies who are being killed are just borrowed for the really, really desperately sick teenagers. I think we have to look at that part of our life now, which is not only connected to guns, but to the fact that our education is lacking, and instead of looking at what we teach, we're being told what not to teach. And my responsibility now is to do what I can to speak up for what we should be doing in the classroom.
And I'll just add very quickly two things. Social media, right? I mean,
Yes.
and the contagion of exemplars of violence, the way in which social media disorganizes the emotions of kids who are already struggling to develop the capacity to express themselves and organize their personalities. And then you add to that the ubiquitous availability of guns, right? You would have troubles, you would have suicides, you would have bullying, you would have aggression. but you wouldn't have mass shootings if the automatic rifles were not available, if the high capacity magazines for pistols were not available so readily, so easily to so many kids, right? And so, by the way, how's this for ending on a cheery note? I think one of the things we should anticipate, since Trump is going to trial, is increased likelihood of political violence in our
Yes,
society.
and
There
more.
was a member of Congress who, when the indictment came out, said now is not the time to turn in your automatic rifles.
Ah.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, that
Oh,
was,
let's say it again.
Tucker Carlson said that.
Tucker Carlson said that, not a member of Congress. Okay, thank you for the correction. All right, everybody. So that shoe dropped this week, which means we didn't conclude our lecture series yet on the lifespan revolution. More to come, more to talk about as these things begin to unfold. Good being with you as always. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next Saturday. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.